Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 28 and 29. So let's begin. Izuku, please do not use your quirk on the apprehension test. Mr. Rikuho sounded tired as he said that. I'm not, sir, Izuku immediately replied. Yeah, he can't, sir. His quirk is fireproofing, one of the others said. Izuku thought it was Shigeru but wasn't completely certain. Mr. Rikuho looked at Izuku in askance. That is my quirk, sir, he answered the question. No other aspects of it? The physical education teacher asked. No, sir. The man sighed and made several more notes on his tablet. How did you throw so far? The question was put to Izuku. This time he knew it was Naoki asking. It wasn't that far, Izuku whispered. Compared to what Tomura could throw, he hadn't thrown the ball that far at all. Of course, compared to what he could throw when he could use his quirk, it wasn't that far either. Dude. I think you beat Setsuna. Who's Setsuna? Izuku asked. Oh, I forgot, you're new. Setsuna Tokage. Naoki gave him the explanation. She's in one of the other classes. She can throw like super far and she's super fast. Ah, Izuku nodded while the rest of the class went through the ball throw. Mr. Rikuho had announced that they would start the year with it. He'd hinted they'd finish the year with the standard test so that they could see improvement. Still, how did you throw it that far? Shigeru asked. Izuku knew it was him since he'd been called by Mr. Rikuho. I do some physical training. Izuku admitted. Hero training? Naoki gasped the question, and Izuku could hear the awe in his voice. Just training, Izuku dismissed it. Tomura would call it grinding but Kurogiri always called it physical training. From what he knew, Kurogiri's name was probably closer to what was publicly acceptable. Must be intense. Not really, Izuku shook his head. They were being called up in groups of 5 to run the 50 meters dash. Just constant, he explained. Kurogiri had him doing training almost every day. Izuku could see that it was paying off now. Sometimes Tomura was with them but the older boy usually trained during the day. When Tomura was there, they worked on basic fighting. Izuku had gotten very good at dodging Tomura's hands, especially since the boy didn't wear his gloves. He'd lost enough t-shirts to dust that he knew he never wanted to let Tomura reach him. Naoki couldn't say much more because he was called up with Izuku. After they'd run, with Izuku coming in first, the other boy was gasping for air too hard to keep asking questions and Shigeru's group was called. You're not even panting, Shigeru managed to say when he returned, glaring at Izuku. Naoki had managed to get his breathing under control but he glared as well. It had taken significantly longer for him than for Izuku. Practice, Izuku dismissed it. What is Setsuna's quirk? He asked. Lizard tail or something, Naoki replied at the same time as Shigeru managed to gasp out, lizard tail splitter. Green eyes blinked. What does it do? It's kind of gross. She can split off bits of herself and move them around. And regenerate them. She's already training to be a hero. That's fantastic. Izuku gushed. There's so many applications. Yeah, there are, Shigeru grumbled but before Izuku could ask, they were called to perform the grip strength test and then to the rest of the tests. It wasn't until lunch that they could talk again. Sit with us, Naoki invited. Izuku was surprised and thrilled. Last year no one had wanted to talk to him and he'd gotten used to eating his lunch alone. That someone asked him. Sure. Izuku chirped brightly, fetching the bento Kurogiri had made for him. They made their way outside and took a seat under the trees. There were lots of other students there too but everyone seemed happy. There was a lot of chatter about how the summer holidays had been spent. That wasn't unexpected given that this was the first day. The green-haired boy unpacked his bento and took his chopsticks out. Kurogiri had made him a tonkatsu bento, with a green seaweed salad in one of the other openings. That's an awesome bento, Shigeru said. Izuku smiled and nodded before he looked over to the other boy's lunch. He appeared to have Western-style sandwiches and some cut fruit. Yours looks good too, he commented. Nah, this is everyday, Shigeru said. Mum makes it. Kurogiri makes mine, Izuku said as he scooped up some rice. Who's Kurogiri? Naoki asked. He had what appeared to be meatballs over rice with a tomato salad. Izuku paused. He'd never really had to think about who Kurogiri was to him. He was the person who took care of him while his dad was at work. Is he your nanny? Naoki suggested. No, Izuku said softly, still thinking. Au pair? Shigeru offered. What's that? Someone who lives with you and does the housework and takes care of you, came the explanation. That was closer. Kurogiri takes care of Tomura, Izuku said. And me. But he runs a bar, he added. Are your parents gone? No, Dad works. He's separated from my mother, Izuku explained. He thought they were separated. Dad never said otherwise. The two boys looked at each other and then shrugged. Izuku seemed cool even if he didn't have a standard home life. When you are 8, that's really all that was important. Which way do you walk home, Izuku? Naoki asked at the gate. That way, Izuku said, pointing to the left. Too bad. Shigeru and I go right, Naoki replied. We'll see you tomorrow? Izuku nodded and adjusted the straps on his backpack. He felt perversely happy that they couldn't walk with him. No one had walked with him last year, and if they did, it was only to mock him. It felt better that they went their own way. He felt safer. Just don't walk with him, Shigeru warned, thrusting his chin in the direction of another boy. Izuku looked to where Shigeru meant. There was a boy his own age standing there. He had dark purple hair and half-closed eyes. He looked tired as he walked towards the gate of the school. Why not? Izuku asked. His quirk, it's bad, Naoki said seriously. Bad? You mean he can't control it? Izuku had heard of that. Sometimes people just couldn't control their quirks. They usually went to counseling until they could, or sometimes they used quirk suppressants. They were the type of people his dad helped, when the government wouldn't notice. He can control it, Shigeru spat. He'll control you with it, he added venomously. What? Shush. Naoki said. He'll hear you. Izuku rather thought he'd hear the stage whisper just as much as normal conversation, but he played along. What do you mean? The two boys remained silent until the purple-haired boy had passed by. They glared at him surreptitiously. It was only when the other boy was walking down the street did Naoki give him an answer. His quirk is a villain quirk, he explained. It's mind control. If you answer him, he can control you. Oh, Izuku said. Just don't walk with him, Shigeru reiterated, and the two of them turned and began walking up the street in the opposite direction to Izuku. Izuku knew what it was to be alone because you had no quirk. He knew what it was to be isolated because you were unpopular. He hadn't realized that people with quirks could be bad, just because of their quirk, but he knew that the boy was alone. And that was pain enough. Like for Himiko. Her quirk made her alone. He turned to follow the purple-haired boy, but he was already gone. There was always tomorrow. Daddy? Yes, Izuku? Hisashi asked his son. They were practicing his fine control, but all for one knew that Izuku would need a new quirk soon to work on. To his eyes, there was only the slightest discoloration to his son's quirk caused when it absorbed other quirks. He could only see it too because the weight-altering quirk was such an unusual color. Dr. Garaki would be pleased to know that Izuku was absorbing quirks faster the older he got. Can a quirk be bad? It was a question he'd been expecting, but not yet. He'd been expecting it after Izuku permanently took a quirk from someone. What brought this on? As far as Hisashi knew, Izuku's first day of class at his new school went well. Kurogiri hadn't reported any problems, and Izuku had already regaled him with stories of making 2 new friends. Naoki said that someone's quirk was bad. Did he mean out of control? Hisashi asked for clarification. No. He said it was bad. Shigeru said it was a controlling quirk. All for one murmured. He might need to look into the school a bit more. There could be something interesting there. No, Izuku. No quirk is bad, he told his son. There are those who use their quirks badly, he making the bad pun and causing his son to smile. But there are no bad quirks. Not in the way his son meant. What about a quirk that makes you a villain? Hisashi shook his head. There were drugs which would remove reason, but that wasn't what Izuku was asking about. No. There's no quirk that makes you a villain. A person chooses that. Sometimes, circumstances force them into it as well, but it's not their quirk. Izuku seemed relieved. Hisashi smiled. I think if you find out about this quirk, you will find out that it's quite normal. It won't be good or bad. For things to be good or bad, especially with quirks, it's about intent. Take my quirk. Or your quirk. We can take quirks from others, Hisashi explained. Most people would say that is bad, and it's a bad quirk, but if we are taking the quirk because the person asked, or because we are trying to help them, how is it bad? It's not bad, is it? Because it's helping. Izuku nodded. Helping people is good. So this quirk, despite what your new friends are saying, isn't bad or good. To make that definition will depend on the person using it. And what they intend to do. If they intend to be good, or if they are doing something bad. Actions, my little dragon, it's all about actions. Hisashi concluded. However, from the vague description of this quirk, it might be one that he wanted. All for One decided that he'd let Izuku do the research, and if it turned out to be interesting, well, he'd have to see. There were lots of options. So why don't you find out about the person first? I will, Daddy. Izuku said. All for One smiled, ruffling Izuku's hair. I look forward to your report. That caused Izuku to grin, and Hisashi sighed theatrically with it. It will have to wait for a few weeks though, he told his son. Daddy? Izuku asked. I've got a business trip, Hisashi announced. You know how some nights, I can't see you because I'm busy with work? He asked. Izuku nodded. That happened at least once a week, but his dad tried to make it up on other nights, or was sometimes there in the morning. He knew his dad worked hard. This time I have to go away for a few weeks, he explained. Kurogiri will take good care of you, and Gigantomachia will be there too. He didn't expect any trouble, but there was no way he was leaving his son unprotected. Will you be okay? His son was a good boy. He knew better than to cry, even though Hisashi could see that he wanted to. It was one thing to not see him of an evening, but another to know he would be gone. This was the first time he'd be gone for a long time from Izuku. I will be, Izuku assured him. Hisashi smiled. I'll bring you back a present, he assured his son. That cleared up the tears, and All for One laughed. He'd bring back the perfect present. Gigantomachia, can you help me? Izuku looked up at the huge man as he asked. They were walking home from his school. He'd been so surprised to see Gigantomachia there the first day that he hadn't been able to catch up to the purple-haired boy. And the guy was hard to find in school. Little Lord? I've been trying to talk to someone, Izuku said, suddenly feeling shy. Gigantomachia obviously didn't know what to say at that. The large man looked down at him with a questioning expression. Izuku took a deep breath. I can't catch him at school, and he won't wait to speak to me after school. So I need your help. Who is it, little lord? Gigantomachia asked. Izuku pointed ahead of them to where the purple-haired boy was walking. In truth, Izuku wasn't sure what assistance he wanted from Gigantomachia. In an abstract way, he'd been thinking that maybe the large man would offer him some advice, or something like that. He was not expecting Gigantomachia to gently pick him up and make 2 bounds to catch up with the other boy, putting a large arm down in his way. The boy cried out in shock. Gigantomachia didn't quite growl, but it was close. You talk to little lord, he said. Izuku could feel his face going red. He could feel the stares of those around him. I'm sorry, he yelled as he slid down from Gigantomachia's hand. I'm sorry. I just wanted to talk to you, he said, bowing slightly at the boy. When Izuku looked up, the other boy was looking at him with dark purple eyes. He didn't appear to be too tired today. I noticed that you were always alone, and Izuku faltered, but he forced himself to continue. It isn't nice to be alone. It was only now, after he'd spent a few days with Naoki and Shigeru, that he realized he'd been terribly lonely at school last year. He didn't want anyone else to feel that way. Not if he could help it. You wanted to talk? There was an edge to the question. Of course. Izuku replied happily. Shut up and go home. Izuku didn't know what happened, but the next thing he knew, Gigantomachia was picking him up and he wasn't outside the school. He shook his head. Little lord? The huge man asked worriedly. I'm okay, Izuku replied immediately, still wondering when he had almost made it home. What happened? The bad one used his quirk on you, Gigantomachia told him. I won't let it happen again, little lord. Izuku heard Gigantomachia's hands creak as he said that, so tight were his fists. No. It's okay. He didn't do anything wrong. Little lord? He didn't. It's okay, Izuku repeated. Thank you for helping. Little lord. He used his quirk on you. Gigantomachia objected. It's okay. He was probably scared. I'll talk to him tomorrow, Izuku said quickly. He wasn't sure how he knew that he had to calm the giant down. You helped lots. At least this way. Izuku had an excuse for talking to the boy, if nothing more to apologize again for Gigantamachia's actions. He had not expected that. His quirk is amazing. Izuku continued. If it worked the way he thought it did, then it really was amazing. And Izuku could forgive him for using it. It would have been scary to have Gigantomachia stand in your way. He looked up at the larger man. The giant didn't look happy, but he did relax as Izuku smiled at him. I will talk to him tomorrow. Izuku declared. Thank you for your help. He felt Gigantomachia's eyes on him, examining him carefully before the giant nodded and the incident was put behind them. I just need to talk to him for a second, Izuku reassured Naoki. You're weird sometimes, you know that, Izuku. His friend said but nodded and let Izuku walk away. Today he'd actually been able to keep track of where the purple-haired boy went at lunch. There was no real secret to it. The boy simply kept to the back of everyone and lay down. It was somewhat confusing, but Shigeru assured him that was normal. Izuku walked over to where the other boy was. He stood a few feet away. Izuku cleared his throat. I'm sorry about yesterday, he said by way of introduction. You're great oaf of a man. I'm sorry, Izuku interrupted. I didn't mean for that to happen. Then what did you want? I wanted to talk to you. Wanting to laugh at the freak? Izuku blinked. Of course not. He objected on reflex. I just wanted to talk to you. He heard the other boy blow out a breath. Why? The question was sharp. There were a lot of answers Izuku wanted to give to that question. Because there's no such thing as a bad quirk, was the answer that slipped out. One purple eyebrow raised. I used it on you, the other boy pointed out. If I didn't know him, I'd have probably done the same, Izuku shrugged, then he bowed again. Hi. My name is Izuku Inpei, he introduced himself. It's good to meet you. Purple eyes looked at him sharply. They seemed older than 8, but Izuku was determined. Besides, this boy couldn't glare like Tomura, or like Kurogiri. No one could glare quite like Kurogiri. Hitoshi Shinsu, came the reply. Izuku grinned, as if he'd won a major victory. Do you mean it? Green hair cocked to the side. Mean what? That there is no such thing as a bad quirk, Hitoshi clarified. Izuku nodded emphatically. His lips quirked as he recalled his dad's words. There is no such thing as a bad quirk, but there are quirks used badly. He joked. Hitoshi's face collapsed. I didn't mean it like that. Izuku gasped when he realized the connotations on the statement. I didn't mean it was bad to use your quirk on me, he gushed. I would have used something too, and I'm sorry Gigantomachia startled you. That's his name? Purple eyes were wide. Izuku frowned. Gigantomachia? He asked. Yes, that's his name. Hitoshi snorted and then laughed. Does your family name things literally? I don't think so, Izuku replied. Never mind, the purple-haired boy dismissed the matter. So what did you mean? Izuku took a deep breath. He could tell, he couldn't stuff this answer up, not if he wanted the boy to talk to him. I mean it, there are no bad quirks. There are people with bad intentions who use their quirks, but the quirk itself doesn't dictate anything. You didn't mean anything bad when you used your quirk. You were surprised. And, it's lonely by yourself. I want to be your friend, he finished in a rush. Hopeful that his meaning was clear and that his expression portrayed how much he meant the words. I'm not lonely. Izuku simply looked back at Hitoshi. He'd been alone last year, when people thought he was quirkless. Sure, he had spoken to Himiko and that was great, but no one in his class ever wanted to talk to him. That was the way people were, his dad told him, but his dad hadn't said that people did it to those who had a quirk too. Either way, it wasn't right. What do you want really? Hitoshi challenged him. To be your friend. Why the hell would you want to be his friend? The two boys spun to stare at the girl who'd spoken. Izuku immediately saw that she had dark green hair and dark green eyes which seemed large. There was a smirk adorning her features which were set in a distinctly disapproving look. Why wouldn't I want to be his friend? Izuku asked. He missed the way Hitoshi looked at him as if he'd grown a new head. The girl sniffed. Because he has a bad quirk, she replied. Civilians can't use their quirks and frankly that will be his only saving grace. She added. It sounded like she was quoting from somewhere. Civilians? Izuku asked dumbly. I'm training to be a hero, the girl announced. I guess you are too, given your abilities. I'm not. What? I'm not training to be a hero, Izuku repeated. He'd started training with Kurogiri because Tomura had been doing it. And now it was just a habit. He knew heroes had to be strong, but he wasn't as sure as he had been, and he couldn't say he was training specifically to be a hero. Then how did you beat my scores? She growled. He saw the way her fists clenched and she stomped one foot with the question. I wasn't trying to, Izuku tried to console her. He really hadn't been trying to beat anyone's scores with Mr. Rikujo's tests. He was just doing his best. She looked at him. Izuku just waited for her to say something, but all he got was a glare before she spat and walked away. Izuku turned back to Hitoshi. He raised one purple eyebrow at him. I really do want to be your friend. Izuku assured him. Even though it will make Setsuna hate you? Even though it will make Setsuna hate me, Izuku replied. He hadn't known who she was, but given what Naoki had said to him on the first day of school, it made sense. Even though I used my quirk on you? He smiled. Even though you used your quirk, he said. If Izuku was honest, he was really curious about Hitoshi's quirk. He wanted to know what it did, how it worked. He wanted to know everything. Because while everyone else said it was a bad quirk, he knew there was no such thing as a bad quirk. On that, Izuku was sure his dad was right. There were misused quirks, but it was people who misused them, and you couldn't blame the quirk for that. Hitoshi shook his head. I'll think about it. Izuku grinned. For today, that was good enough. Oi, Kurogiri, when did you get another brat? The question wasn't one Izuku had expected. He stood in the doorway to the back room of the bar, holding on to the edge of it. The bar was louder than he expected. He thought Kurogiri said it was less busy on weekdays, but this was packed. The misty man jerked at the question and Izuku heard him put down a glass. Then Kurogiri blocked his view of the bar. Izuku? Is everything okay? The green-eyed boy could hear the worry in the misty man's voice. He nodded. I couldn't sleep, he whispered. He'd wanted to talk to Kurogiri, but he hadn't expected this many people. It was intimidating to the 8-year-old. Kurogiri put one hand on his shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. I'll get you some milk, he told Izuku. It wasn't what he wanted, but in the noise of the bar, Izuku didn't know how to insist. Some milk. Ha! Give him some milk. Someone called out. For some reason that made Kurogiri stiffen. There was laughter in the bar, but Izuku didn't know what it was about. Gigantomachia, Kurogiri called the man as he steered Izuku into the back room. Izuku only noticed that the enormous man was in the corner of the bar when he moved. He didn't know how he'd missed him earlier when he was staring. Izuku saw Gigantomachia move across the bar before Kurogiri took him through the back room into the kitchen. There was a cry followed by a crunch, but as Kurogiri ignored it, Izuku figured it couldn't be too important. Sit there, Izuku, Kurogiri instructed. Do you know why you couldn't sleep? He asked as he went to the fridge and pulled out some milk. He went to the stove to heat it up. I wanted to talk to Daddy, Izuku said. He's still in China on business, the misty man answered immediately. Did something happen at school? Kurogiri had asked earlier, but Izuku hadn't said anything. That was just the usual question about his day, but after dinner he'd been thinking about what happened. Sort of, Izuku answered. The misty man said, turning slightly. He poured a small measure of milk into a saucepan. Izuku wasn't sure what to say. He didn't know how to explain what he was feeling. I meet the hero Gargoyle on my birthday, he said instead. Kurogiri nodded. Everyone was aware that Izuku had met Gargoyle. He told me that heroes are just people, and so there are good and bad heroes, but that they are there to maintain the status quo. Yes, that is correct, Kurogiri agreed, stirring the milk. Do you want cocoa or plain milk? Cocoa please. Izuku smiled. The bartender reached out to another cupboard and brought out a small box. I met someone at school today. She is training to be a hero, he continued his story. What was she like? Kurogiri questioned. He had no idea where Izuku was going with this, but was acutely aware that this was the sort of conversation All for One would want to have with his son. Tomura was his primary charge, but the misty man knew that Izuku was more important to All for One. That's why he was raising him himself. He really hoped whatever answers he gave now were correct. She was mean. Izuku wailed quietly. Kurogiri quickly checked to make sure he wasn't crying. Thankfully he wasn't. She looked down on everyone who couldn't use their quirk and she was mean about Hitoshi's quirk. That was a new name. Hitoshi? Kurogiri asked carefully, trying to recall if Izuku had mentioned him before. The boy with purple hair. That made the name fit in better with what Izuku had been saying about school. He had been talking about a boy with purple hair for a few days. Gigantomachia had mentioned something as well. Ah, you know his name now. Kurogiri praised, to cover the fact he hadn't automatically known. Izuku beamed up at him. But he's all alone, and I want to be his friend. The green-haired boy said. But this girl, she was mean to him, and she's training to be a hero. She was selfish, because all she seemed to care about was that I beat her scores during Mr. Rikujo's test. The bartender took his time to stir some cocoa powder into the warming milk, making sure that Izuku could see what he was doing. What you are seeing is the truth Gargoyle told you about, Kurogiri said eventually. He was meant to let Tomura make his own connections and conclusions on things, so he wasn't sure how much he should lay out for Izuku. But given that he was only 8, some direction would probably be needed. But she doesn't want to help people, or she'd help Hitoshi. Why is she training to be a hero? They are meant to help people. Izuku cried out. Kurogiri turned to look at him. He wasn't completely sure what Gargoyle had spoken about, but he could make some educated guesses. What did Gargoyle tell you? He asked Izuku, hoping he could get the green-haired child to make the connections himself. That heroes are people. And what does that mean? Kurogiri continued to lead Izuku through the logic. That they are good and bad, came the immediate response, though the bartender could see the way that Izuku's green eyes were misting with tears. But she's bad and she's going to become a hero. This time the tears did spill out. Heroes are meant to be good, Izuku sobbed. They are meant to help people. But they can't help people if they are just keeping things the same. Kurogiri turned off the stove. And went to Izuku. He embraced the boy, letting Izuku cry onto his shoulder. It was a difficult thing, having your beliefs shattered. The misty man rubbed Izuku's back, wishing that he'd put the lid on the pot. He hated the smell of half-warmed milk, but Izuku took precedence. Eventually his tears cleared and he pulled back slightly. There are others who help people, Kurogiri said gently. They are not recognized for it though. And some would call them villains, but they help people nevertheless. Because not everyone wants to see the world continue unchanged. Izuku gulped, swallowing down snot and tears. Who helps people? Kurogiri cocked his head, silently asking the question. Izuku knew the answer. Dad? Came the slow, almost disbelieving question. The misty man nodded, blinking once to add emphasis. Why would people call Dad a villain? Izuku demanded. Logically, Kurogiri knew there were a lot of reasons why All for One would be called a villain, and he knew the man himself would not deny them and would probably revel in some of them. But, not to his 8-year-old son. Gargoyle told you, Kurogiri reminded Izuku. Your dad helps people and wants things to get better, for everyone, not just for the people the Hero Association wants. Again Izuku gulped and Kurogiri could see that he was thinking. He knew the green-eyed boy wanted to talk to his dad, and truthfully, Kurogiri would have been much happier if this conversation was one Izuku could have had with All for One. You want to help people, don't you Izuku? That's why you want to be Hitoshi's friend? Izuku nodded. Because he's all alone. Then maybe you can't do that as a hero, Kurogiri prompted. But there are other ways. For now though, you need to get back to sleep, he added. Now that the crying storm had passed, he could see the way Izuku was blinking, desperately trying to remain awake. He lifted the green-haired boy as he rose, settling Izuku on his hip, and turned back to the stove. There was a skin on the half-finished cocoa, but if he lifted that away, it could be saved. With Izuku's head resting on his shoulder, Kurogiri skimmed off the skin and turned the stove on again to heat up the cocoa. Izuku was almost fully asleep by the time the cocoa was done and he'd carried him back up to bed. Kurogiri passed the sleeping boy the cup as he laid him down and pulled the covers. It was only another moment before Izuku was asleep and the misty man took the empty cup and stood up. He'd have to call All for One to let him know what had happened. He was sure Sensei would be pleased. End chapters 28 and 29, The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Author note, this is 8-year-old Hitoshi. While people are saying that his quirk is bad and villainous, he hasn't had it drummed into him for quite as long, therefore the barriers for Izuku to get over to make friends aren't as high or wide. They are there, you can see them, and over the next few years Hitoshi would make them huge as the bullying continued. But he has Izuku as a friend now, so while some people will bully him, and the barriers will go up for strangers, Izuku has a door in the base of the barriers that he just walks through. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.